Hello and welcome into the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Higley. Today's episode is about testing and monitoring strength. Now, not from a gadget perspective, and also not from a powerlifting only lens, but instead from the standpoint of decision making. Because data is not useful simply because it exists. If you never test or monitor anything, you're always guessing. And on the other side, if you test constantly, then you're always reacting. Now, good training lives somewhere in the middle. So before we talk about how to test strength or even what to track, we need to get very clear on a more basic question. Why measure strength at all? Strength testing exists for one primary reason, and that is to reduce uncertainty over long time horizons. That's ultimately it. It is not there simply to motivate you, and it's not there to validate your identity as a strong person, and it's not there to replace coaching judgment. Strength is a slow biological adaptation. It unfolds over months and years, not workouts and weeks. And unlike body weight or heart rate, strength is not directly observable. You don't wake up knowing whether your force production capacity has increased. You can only see it expressed under certain conditions and at certain times. And that's why testing exists. It's not to provide certainty, but it's to narrow the range and the margin of error. Now, when testing is used correctly, it does three things. First, it constrains your ego, right? It forces you to confront the reality rather than a memory or emotion. Second, it helps to guide your long-term planning. It tells you whether the program that you're running is producing adaptation or simply fatigue. And third, it allows a recalibration of sorts. That's of load, that's of your effort, that's of your expectation. Now, what testing does not do well is give you day-to-day answers. Strength can fluctuate, readiness can fluctuate, and motivation can fluctuate. And testing is not meant to capture those fluctuations. Instead, it's meant to sit above them. And this is where people start to get into trouble, right? They're either avoiding testing entirely because one, they don't want bad news, or they're being lazy, or they test all the time. They're testing constantly because they want that reassurance. And neither approach works. Avoiding the measurement means that you don't know whether your training is actually effective. And over measuring means that you start to mistake the noise for signal. And both of these lead to the same problem, and that you don't know how to adjust. Now, when people hear testing and monitoring, their minds tend to jump towards technology, right? Bar speed and different types of trackers and different types of force plates, maybe even variables like HRV, all of it. And those tools absolutely do have a place. But before we can talk about what those tools can offer, we instead need to be very clear about what they cannot do. Now, when people hear data-driven strength training, what they usually picture is that technology. These velocity trackers and force plates and heart rate variability, maybe readiness scores and different dashboards that update every morning and are constantly pulling in data. And to be clear, these tools are not fake. They're not a scam. And in certain environments, they can be genuinely useful. In a more high-performance setting, we can measure bar velocity to be able to monitor fatigue and intent of a workout. We can use force plates to track jump performances, different asymmetries, or changes in your rate of force development. And we can use HRV or heart rate variability to get a rough sense of your autonomic stress. Now, those tools add resolution, but there's a critical point in that they do not make training smarter by default. They only make already intelligent coaching more precise. Technology can't replace thinking, and a force plate can't tell you why your performance changed. A bar speed velocity tracker cannot tell you whether the athlete slept 4 hours, had a fight at home, Maybe they're accumulating more stress outside of the gym. And their heart rate variability can't tell you whether it's time to push volume, reduce the intensity, or change or modify exercise selection. Those decisions still require experience, context, and a model of adaptation. And without that, those tools become expensive thermometers, right? They give an accurate reading, but there's no real diagnosis. And there's also a practical reality that matters, and that is that most everyday athletes don't have access to this technology. They can't access force plates. They don't train in an environment that is constantly being monitored, and they also don't need that secondhand readiness scores. And even when they do have access, the question still remains the same. What would you do differently if the number changed? If the answer is nothing, then the measurement is simply decoration on your program. And this is where I think a lot of well-intentioned athletes and coaches start to get lost. They start collecting this data before they've defined what decision the data is going to inform and what decisions actually need to be made. So the tools, they get more advanced, but the training stays reactive. And this is the part that often gets overlooked. You don't need lab-grade equipment to be able to monitor your strength effectively. And in fact, most meaningful strength decisions can be made with the tools that are already available to almost anyone. A simple logbook and tracking the lifts and rating of perceived exertion, maybe occasional 1-rep max or repetition-based testing. And on a day-to-day basis, basic autoregulation. Now that's the system that actually works in a real world for an everyday athlete. And that's where we're going to spend the bulk of this episode. Now, if we strip away the technology, what we're really trying to answer with our strength monitoring is simple. And that is, am I progressing? And am I recovering? And should my training change? Now, for most people, those questions can be answered without these advanced tools if the fundamentals are in place. Now, I think of strength monitoring as a simple stack. Not everything needs to be sophisticated, but every layer does need informed decisions. If you don't write things down, then you're not monitoring anything. You're instead going to rely on memory, and our memories are very unreliable. They are very biased and often emotional. So at a minimum, a training log should capture the exercise, the load, the reps, and some indication of effort. That can be percentages, that can be RPE, but ultimately that's it. This doesn't have to be fancy. A notebook, pen and paper works. An app works. Something like Train Heroic also works. But what matters is the consistency with tracking and logging. Strength progress isn't visible workout to workout, but it only shows up across months. And so the logbook gives you that longitudinal data. These are patterns, not snapshots. And without it, you don't know what actually worked, and you don't know what did. And without it, you don't know what actually worked, and you don't know what didn't. Now, RPE gets dismissed because it's subjective. But that's exactly why RPE is valuable, because it captures things that we can't measure easily. Our accumulated fatigue, our recovery status, the psychological strain, and our readiness to be able to express that strength. And when the same load and the reps feel harder over time, that is information. And when they feel easier, that's information too. Now, RPE is noisy, but it's consistently noisy. And when you start to look at it across weeks instead of single sessions, those patterns begin to emerge. And importantly, RPE also forces honesty. It anchors effort to reality instead of ego. Now, this is where monitoring starts to turn into decision making. If you're not testing and you're not adjusting the loads, then you're essentially running last month's assumptions into the next month and then ultimately forever, right? Auto-regulation allows us to solve that. Using a rep max performances, using estimated maxes, there are various equations to be able to calculate those, and RPE anchors. This allows you to update training loads without constant max testing. Now, if a top set moves well at a lower RPE than you expected, that's going to be signal. Now, if loads that should be manageable start to creep toward failure, then that's going to be signal. Those signals allow you to be able to adjust your training maxes, scale your volume, and manage fatigue in real time. It's not guesswork. Instead, it's that structured feedback that we need. And here's the key point. This entire system works even if you never touch a velocity tracker, a force plate, an HRV app, because it's built around consistency and trends and decision making instead of novelty. But there's an important distinction that we still need to make, and that is that tracking data is not the same thing as using that data. And this is where a lot of people will get stuck, right? They collect these numbers, they look at them, they look cool, they look pretty, and then nothing ultimately changes. So we need to talk about what data is actually for and why tracking without agency over that data is mostly a waste of time. This is the mistake I see more than any other. People will collect data, but they don't do anything with that data. They log their sessions, they rate RPE, and they track readiness scores, and they review pretty graphs, and then they continue to train the exact same way anyways. So at that point, the data isn't monitoring. Instead, it's just journaling. It's just logging. Monitoring only matters if the information allows you to change decisions. Now, every metric that you track should be able to answer a specific question, right? If bar speed drops, what changes? If our estimated max increases, what changes? If RPE trends upward for the same workload, then what changes? If the answer is nothing, then that metric doesn't belong in your system. And this is where a lot of well-intentioned athletes start to get overwhelmed. They feel like they should be tracking things. They hear that data-driven training is important, so they start to collect numbers without truly understanding what those numbers imply. And that creates anxiety instead of clarity for your training. And here's the blunt truth. If you don't know how to interpret your data, then you only have two options. You can either learn or you can hire someone who already knows. But collecting data without the ability to act on it doesn't make training smarter. It just makes things more complicated. And this is also why these minimal systems that I talk about often outperform the more complex ones. A simple logbook reviewed consistently will beat a dashboard that no one knows how to interpret, because clarity matters more than volume of data. Now, up to this point, we've talked about strength monitoring, mostly in the context of strength itself. But for most everyday athletes, strength isn't the end goal. It's a capacity that supports your other goals. And that's where testing and monitoring strength becomes even more important, especially whenever your training priorities change. Now, for most everyday athletes, strength is not their sport. They're not trying to deadlift 700 pounds. They're not peaking for a powerlifting meet. They're training for their life. They're training for performance and durability, which means that strength should be thought of as a capacity and something that they ultimately build to a sufficient enough level and then level off and maintain. And that framing changes how and why we monitor it. At certain points throughout the year, strength is going to be the priority. You'll push it, you'll build it, and you'll test it. But then at other points, whenever conditioning volume increases, when our running mileage climbs, when our training becomes more endurance and conditioning focused, then we'll move and transition into maintenance mode. And this is where monitoring matters most. So take something like high rocks preparation or even marathon training. As our conditioning volume goes up, then recovery resources are going to start to get strained. Our joints and our muscles are going to accumulate more stress, and our strength expression is going to become harder due to that fatigue. And if strength was never built to a sufficient level to begin with, then it's going to decay fairly quickly. And that doesn't always show up as missed lifts, but instead it shows up at these nagging injuries, this loss of efficiency, this inability to tolerate the volume and the intensity. And so strength testing in these phases isn't about chasing PRs. Instead, it's about answering a simpler question, in that, is this foundational capacity being maintained? And that is why occasional strength testing still matters, even whenever strength isn't the main primary focus. If you don't check it, then you don't know when it's starting to slip. And once it slips too far, then rebuilding that strength back often becomes expensive in time, in energy, and an injury risk. So at this point, we've talked about why strength testing exists and which tools actually matter, and how to be able to monitor with minimal equipment and minimal involvement. And then ultimately why strength still matters even when it's not the primary goal. But what we haven't addressed yet is the timing. So when should you actually test? And how often? And that's what we'll close with next. Now, one of the biggest mistakes in strength training is treating testing like a ritual. Either it happens all the time or it never happens. And neither approach works. Testing ultimately only makes sense at decision points. And those can include at the end of a training block, before a planned shift in your focus, or after a layoff or injury, or when progress is stalling. And ultimately, even when perceived effort and performance stop matching. In those moments, testing reduces uncertainty, right? It tells you whether that you should keep going or adjust your training or change direction. And outside of those moments, constant testing mostly creates additional noise. Testing also doesn't have to mean maximal effort testing every single time. Structured repetition maxes and consistent movements and controlled conditions are often much more useful than frequent 1-rep max attempts. The goal with testing is calibration, not heroics. And this is what brings us back to the central idea of the episode. Strength testing and monitoring are not about collecting more data, more numbers, and things that we don't even know how to use, right? Things that overwhelm us. Instead, it should be about decision making. If you've never measured, then you're always guessing. And if you measure all the time, then you're always reacting. The sweet spot is using just enough information to be able to reduce that uncertainty over these long time horizons. You can use a logbook. You can track effort. Occasional testing at the end of a block or at certain phases throughout the year. And you need to have the willingness to adjust. That's it. Data should reduce your confusion, not create new additional rituals. It should make your training simpler and not more fragile and not more complex. And if there's one takeaway from this episode, it's this, and that good training lives between blind intuition and the obsessive quantification. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to the Everyday Strength Podcast. Thanks for spending part of your day here with me. If the conversation gave you something actionable, then make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. And don't be shy about leaving a comment or a 5-star review. It helps more people to find the show, and it tells the algorithm that this information matters. If you want to dive deeper into the physiology and the practical tools behind great training, then join the Performance Edge Network. Every week, I send out a newsletter with research I'm reading, lab insights, deep dive breakdowns, and training topics and conditioning strategies, and things that I'm experimenting with in my own programming. It's free to join, and it's designed to make you a smarter athlete and a more capable human. And if you need a structured plan, I've built programs for exactly that. The Peak Performance Program is my go-to for athletes who want elite strength and conditioning. I also have the Peak 3X program, which takes the meat and potatoes from peak performance and condenses it into just 3 days per week for the busiest athletes. And I've got other programs for hybrid athletes, endurance development, and for people who simply want to look, feel, and perform better in everyday life. You can find all of those at HigleyStrength.com. Thanks for listening, keep training hard, and I'll see you next time.